Good afternoon, or whatever time it may happen to be where you are and when you happen to be watching this. This time we're going to look at making a score counter using Playmaker in Unity. The score counter is relatively simple if you think of it just in terms of it being simply a number. Right? Because it's a number, we can do things to it like add to it and subtract from it and multiply and so on and so forth. Right? And if we just keep that in mind, that all this score thing is a number, we can really start to better understand how we need to do this and understand this. Because all it is a number, we're going to represent it as a certain type of variable. There's two types of variables that we could use for this. We could either use a floating point variable, where we'd have decimal places. And if you want something with that, then that's what you'd use. But most scores tend not to have decimal places. And so instead, use an integer. We will be using an integer. And that's basically all score is. I'm going to just make myself an empty object. Okay, game object. I'm going to call this my game manager. All right, and all this object is going to do is just keep track of different things that no other entities in my scene here need to keep track of or should keep track of. Okay. So on my game manager, I'm just going to create a new FSM. There we go. And this FSM can be, do whatever. This one in particular will do the scoring, or at least update the part of our UI that shows what the score is. Okay, so I'm going to call this FSM, call it score control or something like that. Again, the game manager, all it's going to do is just going to be an object that has a whole bunch of different FSMs on it that control things like the score and say, how to manage levels and all that sort of stuff that say, an individual piece might not need to manage. Right? So inside the score control, I haven't done anything yet. And I probably won't here for a short while because I'm going to make some other object that's going to adjust my score. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create that score variable. Now we could create a local variable inside of this score control FSM. And that would work if all of our game were to take place in this single scene. Right? If all we were to do was load this scene and then just load in different assets but stay within the scene. If we need to travel between scenes, say we've set up a number of different levels in a number of different scenes, we're going to want to use a global variable because it's going to transfer between scenes. If we just leave it as a local variable, once we leave the scene and go into our next level or our next scene, whatever was stored in this this game manager here, or wherever we happen to be storing it, would go away, and we'd go with whatever is in that new scene. So I'm going to create a global variable. Okay. Global variables are good ways to share variables between different objects and different FSMs across scenes, but don't do what a lot of people do and then simply use the global variables as a means of controlling all variables that need to be communicated back and forth between different FSMs. Right? Be very careful not to just let that become a habit, because that will quickly get you in trouble when you're trying to manage something that should be related to this specific scene, and you're setting a variable for this specific scene, and then you go to a new scene, and it's still set from that previous scene. Okay, so just think of it in terms of the global variables being purely for things that should carry over throughout the game. Okay, so I'm in this global variables section. I'm going to come down, switch my variable type to int for integer, type in score. There we go. We add it, and now it says, hey, you've created this new global asset, okay, or I'm sorry, a new global variable, but it says Playmaker global created. Okay, this will actually create an asset that lives in your project. Okay, assets Playmaker resources. This is where that asset will live, just like everything else in the project's folder. It is an asset that exists, which means it's going to carry over between scenes because it's not specific to this scene. Alright, okay, so there we go. that's all we need to do for this right now. I mean, we've created the score. Right now it's initialized at 0. We're good to go. All right, now we need to figure out how can we change the score. Well, depending upon what it is you want to be doing, maybe you're collecting coins, maybe you're killing enemies, maybe you just happen to accrue score over time. Maybe that's what we'll do today, just to kind of get it going. But however you add to the score is something you're going to have to determine based on what it is that's causing you to score points. I'm just going to say I'm going to create just a couple things that says when this thing hits that thing, it adds to the score, right? And so what we would do is anytime we change the score, we just simply look at that global variable and change it, right? So if we're going to be taking adding score, like you got 100 points, right? We just take whatever's in there now, add 100 to it, and that's the new score. But to show it on screen, what we then have to do is then come in here and then write it to a GUI object or a UI object. And so we'll look at that here as well. Right, I'm going to start creating a couple objects. I'm just going to get myself a plane. No, actually, I'm going to use a cube instead, I think. Cube. And I'm just going to tilt it because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have balls drop on it and create a new sphere. I'm going to just call this score sphere. And what I'm going to do is just say whenever this ball hits the cube just adds score, right? It's like, yay, I scored. And then I'm just going to have this score sphere just keep spawning. So I'm going to just tag this up with something. Say we'll just call this the player. You know, we could call it whatever we want. We could call it ball or whatever. But that way we can get a collision detection with this, and when say this particular object collides with this object, do an FSM that says, hey, we collided, go and add score. And that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and with my cube select, I'll call this score object. Okay, we're going to add an FSM and call this add score. Right, in here, well, that's the state. We'll call this score there. We'll call this wait for collide. We'll get it one other state. We'll call this one add score. And what we'll do is we're going to start the game. We're just going to come in here. We're going to wait for something to collide with this sphere. And then once it's collided, we'll come here, add score to it. And then we'll come back and wait for something else to collide with it. All right? So in here, we're just going to add a collision. Let's see, a collision event. Okay, and the collision event is going to be found under the physics section. So physics and collision event. All right, so I just double click that, add it. And then in this state, we are looking to collide. When it collides on enter, what are we colliding with? Well, the thing that's tagged player, this is our ball. If you tagged it something else, make sure that's what you choose. And then when this happens, we're going to send an event. There's no events created yet, so we're going to create a new one, call it score, I guess. And then it's going to say, hey, this doesn't send any transition, so click on it. There's our transition. It's giving us another red angry warning sign because this goes nowhere. So if we just click and drag out, there we go. So now what happens is we wait to collide with something called or tagged player. When player collides with us, go and add score. And that's what will happen. If I press play right now, you'll see that's exactly what's going to happen. I'm just going to raise this guy up so we can see it. Do-do-do. And up. Forgot to give this guy a rigid body because otherwise he's just going to hang up there. So I'll just give him a rigid body so he falls. There we go. Now I'll press play. And there it goes and bloop. Oh, I totally missed. Yep, make sure when you're doing this that you have everything set up so you won't miss, or that whenever that you want the score to happen, it actually happens. So let's try one more time. Falling, falling, boing, and there we added the score. All right, now it's going to stay in here. It's not going to do anything. But what we'd want to do is every time a ball hit this, we'd probably want to add score. So we're going to say, okay, when we're done adding score this time, be finished and go back and wait for something else to collide. All right, so that's really it so far. In add score, all we're going to do is just simply add to that integer. Okay, so what integer? The score global variable. We'll add, say, 10 to it every time it happens, not every frame, because otherwise as soon as we hit it, it's just going to add 10 every frame. We don't want that. We just want to do it every time it gets hit by this particular object. All right. Now I've got debug down here checked so I can actually see the value of this variable there. So that's why we have this number here. If you don't see that, just check this debug box. I'll go ahead and press play now, and we can see, okay, so it hit it and it came back, but if we look here, you can see it is indeed 10. The score is 10. If I go and look at my variables and open up my global variables, there's the value is 10. And just to show you that, okay, here it is. Score starts at 0. Okay, we'll press play. Watch when the ball hits it, it will change to 10. Alright, so now we've got the score changing, but the player's not going to know this because there's no thing to message them that the score is going up. Okay, so what we'll do is we will create a UI object, a text that will show us that score. Okay, so we come to game object, go to the UI, and we're going to create simply just a text. Right, when we create UI objects, it's going to create a canvas for us. Also, it'll create this event system. Right, but we're really focused on this text right now. Now, if you're confused at why this is so huge and where it's at in the screen, do not worry about this canvas system. Okay, it's always going to have its lower left-hand corner at the 0, 0, 0 coordinates or the world origin, and then it's going to go over from there all the way to some value here in whole units based on the number of pixels from this corner to that corner, right? And then upwards, it'll be whole units from here to here, the exact number of pixels from here to here. So notice that as I change the size of this game window, I'll just pull it out so we can see it, that changes. Okay, it changes based on the number of pixels in here. All right, so keep this in mind when we go to set up how our anchoring is. Right? And what that means is this is our canvas. Anything within this square will be drawn to our screen if it's in the text. If it's outside, for instance, if I grab my text and I move it outside, you can see it goes off screen. Right? Even though this camera can still see it, the other camera, this main camera, I could back this up all day long and it will never see that. It's because these UI objects don't render to this camera. They render, I guess you could say, directly to an overlay that is, I guess, the last thing drawn. It draws over everything else. And it does not register in any other cameras. There are ways that we can change that. We're not going to focus on that this time. So I'm going to go ahead and put my text back into my screen here. Now what's really important for us is these little, it looks like a pinwheel right now, but what these are anchor points. Okay, we click and drag these, you can see they're changing their little box. But what it says is this new text, this text item, should remain in relation to this area. Okay, so if I were to take this new text and put it in here, it will stay in this area on our screen when I change the size. Or maybe not, maybe I'm thinking something else. Hold on. Okay, so it is, right? So you can see indeed it is still in relation to it, okay? And this is a percentage relationship. Now, if the screen gets too small, though, it looks like it goes away, but it doesn't. It's still there. It's just has become so small in relation to the screen space that it is no longer the display box is no longer large enough to display the text size. So what we want to do is we want to do a couple things. First, we're going to want to pick where we want our score, and then adjust our anchors to make sure that they fit that area. Okay, so if we want it to kind of stick to the upper left-hand corner, we'll kind of do our anchors like that, and then we'll move our text up into that area. Okay, we can also resize this. If we go to this one here, we can kind of say, okay, there we go, and voila. Now, I would not put it directly in the corner like that. I'd give it some extra buffer space. maybe something like that. Okay, but I wouldn't hesitate to put my anchors there because that's fine. Because remember, the anchors are just controlling what percentage of the screen space this text object should take. Right? So the next thing we're going to want to do is come into our inspector for this text item, and in the text script area, this new text, this here is what's actually being displayed. So if I type, something here, you can see it, there it is, something here. Oops. So whatever's in here is what's there. It's like, well, that's good, I guess, but how do I do this during the game? We'll get to that. Below this, we have the character type. Now, I think by default, the only font we have available is Arial. Okay, it is a normal font size. You can make it bold, we can make it italic, and so on. Right? Now, this is not necessarily based on your system fonts. It's just the fonts that Unity has access to. I think you can find or take regular fonts and dump it into the directory of wherever this is found. Library, Unity, default, resources. If you put other fonts in there, you may be able to just use those. I don't know for sure because I haven't really dug into that, but try it. All right, spacing. These are all things that you think of when text, right? How far apart are there between lines? Alignment. Do you want it centered? Do you want it right justified, left justified, top, middle, bottom? Okay, aligned by geometry. I'm not really sure. Let's see. Give me a pop-up. Or not. Okay, the biggest one I would say we want to pay attention to is this best fit. What this will do is it will resize our fonts. It will ignore this font size. Okay, and it will resize our font to fit within this area. Okay, and you think, well, it already fits pretty good. But again, it fits pretty good because our screen is this size. But as we shrink the screen, it starts shrinking that. Our font is staying the same size on the screen, but our screen is getting smaller. So if you got to see, same size font. So instead what we want to do is we'll come in here and we'll turn on this best fit. And what it'll say is we'll try and make this font take up this percentage of the screen regardless of how big that screen is. Right? So I make my screen small. It decreases the size of my font. Okay. And if we make it big, it'll increase the size of my font. You did see that it did go away, but that's because we have a minimum size, meaning if it goes below 10, just don't draw it. So if we made this like, say, 2, which you would not want to do because 2 is not enough pixels to represent a letter, there, it's still there. Still there. There it is. Still there. Okay. I'd leave it at something like 8 at the least. Okay, max size, this is just say, okay, once we reach a certain size, don't go above that. Alright. Color, this is obviously the color of your font. Raycast target, I think this will block raycast, so you can't click through it. You can leave this on or off. I'll probably just leave it as is because for our purposes today with the scoring, it's not really a huge deal. Other things you may want to do are horizontal overflow and truncate. This just says if the text goes outside of our little box here, what does it do? Right now, horizontal overflow will wrap it. So if I were to just go blue, 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 it'll just keep going around and expanding. Overflow will just let it go outside of the box. Truncate will prevent it from going lower. And overflow will just let it go outside the box. Well, it should. There we go. I suppose that, no. Wrap. Well, it's just going to keep wrapping, I guess. Either way, I typically use truncate and overflow or wrap. I guess it depends, but I try to keep everything within this box anyway. Alright, so now we've got this thing. This will be our, I'll just rename this text, call it score text. And what we're going to do with this is every time we do a new score, we're just going to update this. We don't want to constantly update it because our score doesn't necessarily constantly change. We should only update it every time our score changes. That way we're saving resources, not constantly trying to update this every frame. Right? And what we're going to use to update this text item is this game manager score control script, or this FSM. Okay, so in here what we're going to do is when the game starts, it's just going to first it's going to set this score text to be its default. Alright, so if I go back here, I'm going to have to drag this component into my FSM, and to do that, I can't do that like this, right? Because I'd have to drag the whole object, but I just need the component. When I go to grab that component, I select this object, and my FSM goes away. So I'm going to have to lock one of these two things, right? Either I'll have to lock the inspector to keep this present in the inspector, or I'll have to come to the game manager and lock the FSM to keep it present when we select this other object. Since I just happen to have this selected right now, I'll go ahead and lock this. That way I can select my score text, come over here, and there, this FSM is still there. This is the FSM that is on Score Manager. I'll just grab this text script, and I'm just going to place it in here, and I'm going to set property. Okay, just grab the component, drag it into my state, set property. And the property I'm going to set in this is text string. Okay, this text is a string, which means it's just simply a series of characters. Right? So we're just going to set it to be something like score space 0. We could do this a number of ways, especially if we want to do, say, the score to be right justified and left justified. In that case, we'd need two text objects. But for our purposes here, I'm just going to work with what I have, and this will be good. So what this will do is it will, as soon as we press play, it will set this to become score 0. Alright, so we press play, and indeed that is the case. Score is 0. Fantastic. Right? But now we want this to also update this property, this text string, every time the ball hits it, or every time the score changes. Right? And there's a number of ways we can do this, but the way that I like to do it is just have whatever changes the score actually trigger this score control to update the text. Okay, rather than each of them having to update the text. And the reason that is because if we have each different object that adds to the score also update the text, it has to know about the text, it has to know where it is, and it has to call it and say, hey, whatever you are, go ahead and update yourself. Right? Whereas what we can do now is say when we score, it just adds to the string, and then it shouts out to the world, say, hey, whoever's listening, go ahead and add to the score. Alright, so what I'm going to do in my game managers, I'm going to create a new state. We'll just call this one update text. Alright, and then I'm going to use a new event, but it's going to be a global transition. It's going to be like this start. Okay, so I'm going to say add global. First I'm going to have to create it. I'll create it. I'll call it add event. We'll call it, I don't know, add, or maybe update text. There we go. And we'll make this a global by checking this box. And the reason we need to make it global is that way other things can tell it to happen. If we just leave it as a local, we might not be able to get that information. For instance, when the score object or the score object updates our score, it could say, hey, go ahead and update the text, but this is not listening for it because it's not listening on a global scale. So we'll go ahead and click this. Now do note that this global event is not the same as a global variable. These do not carry over. What these mean, okay, what global events are just events that we can call from separate FSMs within the same scene. Alright, so I've got this update text event, and I'm going to come over here to the state and say add global transition update text, and there. Well, that looks different. It's not one of those draw out the string. That's okay. What this is going to do for us is it will, anytime this is called throughout the scene, it will come here and say, hey, do this thing. It'll come down here, do whatever's in here, and it'll just stay in here, which is fine because we don't need it to leave. We don't need it to, in fact, we don't want it to come back here and reset the score to 0. So we'll just say, just hang out in here, right? Because once it's done doing its thing, it's going to just not do it anymore. All right? So there we go. And we can test this out before we start having to update the score string. What we'll do is this. All right? We know we want, let me unlock this. When the score sphere hits this object, well, maybe we'll just call it the player, since that we tag it. So when the player hits the score object, it comes over here, waits for the flag, comes over here, says add to the score. Right? So it's adding to the integer, but it's not telling anything else to draw to the screen. So what we're going to do after we immediately add this, we're going to go ahead and shout it out to the world, say, hey, if you're listening, go ahead and update the score text because it just changed. So we're going to go to our action browser, and here we're going to go down to the state machine heading, and this is going to allow us to get access to all these different actions that allow us to communicate between different FSMs in the scene. All right. To keep things simple, we'll just do a send event, and we're just going to broadcast this. Okay, this may not be the best way all of the time. In fact, a lot of the time it is not the best way. But since we only have one thing listening to update the text, this will work. All right, we're going to say we're going to send this event. Who are we sending it to? Ourselves? Nope. We're going to broadcast to everything in the scene. All right. Now, this is just a simple way of doing it. This may not be the most effective, but it also makes it so we don't have to first find this game manager object, pick its FSM, then send the event. So we'll just go ahead and broadcast it to all. Okay. I guess we could exclude ourselves, but we don't really need to. And we're going to say, hey, we're broadcasting out there for whoever's listening. It is a global event. Update text. There we go. So that way what's going to happen is the ball is going to hit this. It's going to come over here. It's going to say, all right, score, add 10 to it, and then just let everybody know to update the text. Okay, then go back and wait to collide again. All right, so if we go back to our game manager object, the one that's looking for this, okay, watch what happens. We're going to start here in state 1. When the ball hits, it's going to shoot us over here. So we press play, and the ball hit, and there it is. I know it's kind of hard to see the ball hit because that's so far away, but indeed it did hit. Okay. Now, nothing changed to our score up here, right? If we look, score is still 0, even though it comes over here, and even though our variable, where is it, global variables, is 10, we didn't update the text. So that's what we need to do next. Right? So, in our update text zone, what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple things. Okay, we're going to do this same thing here. We're going to set the property. I'm just going to copy this and put it in here. We're going to paste it in here. We're just going to update the score text. We're going to update this here with something, but we're not going to set it to a constant. That's what this is. We type it in as constant. We're going to set it to something that changes. And what is it that changes? Well, we don't have anything, right? We say, well, we could set it to the score integer, but remember, this isn't looking for an integer. This is looking for a string, because that's what that text is. It's a string. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and get that integer, convert it to a string, and then pipe it in here. Okay, but if we were to, no, let's see that. Let's see that. All right, so we need to find a way to convert. If we look, there's a convert heading. Ooh. Hey, check that out. Convert integer to string. We'll just go ahead and do that. And we want this to happen first, because otherwise we're going to end up filling this with nothing. What integer are we converting? That global score. What string variable are we storing it in? Well, we haven't made one yet, so we'll make one. We'll call it score string. There we go. We'll create it. Now the format has mostly to do with, I guess you say numbers, but since we're not using numbers, we're not going to worry about that. We don't want to do it every frame. We just want to do it once, and then we're going to pipe that into that score text. Okay, we're going to set this value to not the constant. This time we're going to go with that score string we just created. All right. So I'll pull up my game window, put it right here. I guess we'll make it 430. So watch this. It is score, the ball hits, and now it's 10. But where did score go? Well, because I'm working out of a single text object, or I guess text object, text item, that score goes away, because remember, that's part of the text that we set up here, score. Okay. Now, if we use 2, we could have one that just said score always, and the other one just has the score number. That would work. Or we could just simply build a string using the variable score string, and we're going to add to that a constant, score. We can do that 2 ways. We can come in here and look for the string, and in here we will build a string. Okay, we're going to build this with parts. We're going to say there's going to be 2 parts. Alright, the first element is going to be a constant. It's going to be score, colon, space. That space does count as part of the string. And then the second thing, or the thing we're going to add to that or build to it, will be that score string there. Now we don't need a separator. That'd be like if we wanted to do, you know, spaces between each of these things, but since I already typed it in here, it's just fine. Okay, add to the end, meaning add one after the other. And then we're going to store this in a string. Now, we could store it right back into that score string because it's happening in order. It's like saying, okay, get score, add whatever's in score string, and then save over score string with what we just had. And there we go. So now if we do this, it'll build that, but then we, again, got to make sure that is above the set text, though, because otherwise this will happen before we build it. Now if we play, there it is, score, the ball hits, and now it's score 10. Notice it got smaller, though. Well, that's because of how the best fit works, right? And truncate, wrap, and overflow. What's happening is it's taking up this entire space with just score 0. And then when it has to add a digit, the text gets smaller. So instead of wrapping to cause it to get smaller, maybe we'll just go ahead and overflow. That way it leaves, right? The other thing we could do is limit the maximum size. Say, we don't want it to get bigger than 30, or maybe we could say leave that at 40. We could leave this at wrap, and then just make our text zone bigger. Score 0, score 10. Okay, so those are the ways we can do that. Now, we could make this a little bit easier by, instead of having to convert the integers to string and then build the string, there's another action that does both of these things for us in a single action. Okay, so that one would be format string. Okay, so it replaces the format item in a specific string with the text equivalent of the variable's value. It basically just does those things we just did. Okay, the format. Wait, is that it? Yeah. One. Okay. Format, we can type in score. This here is our constant at the top of the format. Score, colon. And then instead of having to convert it, convert the integer, we're going to say, oh, the thing that we want to grab is an integer, and it is this score. And then we're going to store that into score string. Okay, all this does is it does our conversion and our string build all in a single action instead of having to use two actions. And there we go. So we press play, and the score updates from the ball. Oops. Why did that happen? That was weird. Try that again. You can see here that score is indeed 10, but the result of scoring is score colon nothing. So I'm not quite sure why that's happening. Maybe we'll add two variables, and we'll make that one a string. And let's try, see if we leave this one as string. There, something like that. Let's try that. See if, I don't think that's going to work, but we can try it. Well, I'm not quite sure why this isn't working like I expected it to, but we do know the other way, so we'll just go back to that one. We're going to do a convert. We're going to build a string. So we'll build it. We'll go to convert, and we will convert our integer to a string, and there we go. So we're going to take the score, convert it into score string. Then we're going to build two different things together. We're going to say score colon space and plus what's stored in score string, save it as score string, and now it's updated. And that is how we do a score counter. Alright, and every time the ball hit, it would just keep going. So I'm just going to take this ball and duplicate it and move it up. I'll take both of them. and duplicate them and move them up. So that way you can see that it keeps doing it. It doesn't just do it once. Fantastic. So that is scoring. Now you can use whatever you want to cause this score to happen. Right? We just use this scoring object. Okay, all this is just a little thing that says when something happens, whenever I collide with something, add to the integer, then tell the game manager score item or score control FSM to update this text object. And that is how the score works. Now if we wanted to do it with coins, you could replace this thing with, say, I don't know, a flashy yellow ball that rotates, right? And instead of using a box collider, you use a trigger. That way you'd use a trigger event instead of collision event. You could have it be, based off of time and just says you start with this much, or and your score goes down. So instead of adding the integer, you just subtract from it. Whatever you want to do, it's all just a matter of manipulating that score integer and then converting it to a string and drawing it to a text UI object. Right? And that's as simple as that. And I think I will leave that here for now. And that will be that.